The first thing my father did was slide a document across the table and say, "Sign it. You are not family in a room where money is discussed." The words landed harder than the cold white light above us in that downtown San Diego law office. The room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and paper dust. Leather chairs shifted as people adjusted their posture, pretending this was normal, pretending a father disowning his daughter over a stack of documents was just business. I did not reach for the paper. I kept my hands on my lap, fingers pressed together hard enough to feel my pulse. My father, Victor, did not look at me again. He turned to the lawyer as if I were already gone. "She is 27, he said with a thin smile. "She cannot even keep a houseplant alive. Let me handle the hotels." Someone on the other side of the table gave a quiet laugh, the kind people make when they want to stay aligned with power. I felt heat rise to my face. Not anger. Not yet something sharper. Humiliation, the kind that comes from being named out loud as small. I had expected control. I had expected pressure. I did not expect him to erase me so cleanly in front of everyone. This was the will reading the meeting where my grandfather's legacy was supposed to be clarified, not stolen. And yet here I was being told to sign away my voice like it was a formality, like my presence was a courtesy, not a right. The paper he pushed toward me was a disclaimer. Temporary management consent, that was what it said on the top, in neat legal print. Temporary is a word people use when they want you to stop asking questions. My throat went dry. I could hear the soft scratch of a pen somewhere down the table, the hum of the air conditioner, the faint creak of leather as my Aunt Tessa leaned forward to watch. She had that look, the one that said, "This is finally happening." I wanted to stand up. I wanted to say something, anything, but years of training kept me still. Do not react. Do not give them drama. Drama is how they discredit you. I pressed my fingernails into my palm and focused on my breathing in and out, even measured, controlled. My father had always said I was too quiet, that silence made people suspicious. He never understood that silence was the only way I survived him. Victor had been running this meeting like a verdict. He spoke in complete sentences, polished, confident, already celebrating. He talked about protecting the brand, about legacy, about responsibility. He talked as if the $62 million hotel empire had been built by his hands alone. 2 beachfront properties, 1 downtown business hotel, franchise agreements, real estate, trust structures, all of it spoken like proof that he belonged at the head of the table and I did not. He glanced at me again briefly, this time with pity. "You can learn by watching," he said. Not deciding, that was when the lawyer, Mara, finally moved. She did not raise her voice. She did not interrupt. She simply slid a folder back toward my father and said, "Sir, you should know better." The room shifted. Felt it before I understood it. Victor frowned, annoyed, as if she had corrected his grammar. He waved a hand dismissively. "We are just trying to move quickly," he said. "She is young. We do not need to complicate this." Mara met his eyes, and for the first time that morning he did not look like the most powerful person in the room. "You should know better," she repeated, "because this trust does not work the way you are describing." My father smiled, then the smile of a man who believes he has already won. "Go ahead," he said. "Read whatever you need to read." She opened the folder. The sound of paper turning was suddenly loud. She read 1 sentence and everything changed. I will not repeat it yet, but I saw it in my father posture first. The way his shoulders stiffened, the way his foot stopped tapping under the table, the way his confidence stalled mid-breath. Around us, the room grew very still. No one laughed this time. No one shifted. My aunt stopped leaning forward. I kept my eyes on the table edge, watching the grain of the wood because I knew if I looked up too soon they would see something on my face, relief, satisfaction, something I could not afford to show yet, because this was not just about winning a moment. This was about something I had been carrying quietly for years. The knowledge that the people who underestimated me needed me to stay small to keep their story intact. That meeting was not the first betrayal. It was simply the one they committed out loud. In that room with the white lights and the bitter coffee, and the document they thought would silence me. My father believed control was a signature away. He believed money erased blood. He believed I would fold like I always had. He did not know that I had stopped being afraid of his voice a long time ago. He did not know that I had read every line of the trust he thought I had never seen. He did not know that the paperwork in that room was about to speak louder than he ever had. If you have ever been underestimated at your own family table, if you have, ever been told to stay quiet while someone else decided your worth, then stay with me. Because what happened next did not involve shouting or tears. It involved one sentence read aloud, and a man who realized too late that losing control feels like losing air. The first place my father ever reminded me who held the power was not a boardroom or a law office, but the dining table in his La Jolla house, where dinner was served on heavy plates and conversations were treated like territory. We sat there most Sundays, a routine that looked normal from the outside roast chicken wine glasses, the quiet hum of the ocean through the open window. Victor sat at the head of the table as always and spoke about money, the way some men speak about weather as something he controlled and others endured. He talked about assets and properties as if they were living things that obeyed him. And every time I tried to add a sentence, he would lift one finger without even looking at me and keep talking. I learned early that interruption was a kind of trespass. He would say things like, "The hotel market is tightening," or "You have to know when to pull capital," and everyone would nod, including relatives who had never owned anything more complex than a car loan. When I finally spoke, once asking a question about a renovation timeline, Victor cut me off, mid-word. He did not raise his voice. He smiled and said, "Let the adults finish." Then he added almost kindly, "You are smart for a kid." That sentence followed me for years. You are smart for a kid. It sounded like praise until you realized it was a ceiling. It was a way of reminding me that no matter what I knew, no matter how carefully I paid attention, I would always be younger, smaller, provisional. He used it everywhere. At dinner, in front of family friends, at holiday gatherings when someone asked what I did for work, Victor would answer for me. "She helps out," he would say. Then he would add, "You are smart for a kid," and laugh, like it was a family joke. I learned not to react, because reacting was exactly what he wanted. Reaction made me dramatic, and drama was how he dismissed women in this family. When my Aunt Tessa once rolled her eyes and said, "Quinn always takes things personally," Victor nodded and said, "See, this is what I mean." 2. Sensitive. The lesson was clear. Silence was safety. Over time, his control became practical, not just verbal. He decided which car I drove and reminded me he paid the insurance. He insisted I use a secondary credit card on his account and framed it as support. "You do not need the stress," he said. "Let me handle it." When I suggested I could manage my own expenses, he looked genuinely offended. "Why would you want that burden?" He asked, as if independence were a flaw. He handled everything that made life run smoothly and then reminded me daily that I could not function without him. If I mentioned changing phone plans, he would say, "Why waste money?" When I asked about updating health insurance, he said I already took care of it. Like a child who could not be trusted with scissors, I watched how he spoke about me to others. When family visited, he would say, "Quinn is still figuring things out." He would never say I was wrong exactly. He just made it sound like I was unfinished, incomplete. I learned to sit through it, hands folded, listening to my own name being used like a disclaimer. Once after dinner, he asked casually, "Do you even know how much the insurance deductible is on that car?" And when I answered correctly, he paused, then said, Well, you are smart for a kid. I smiled and said nothing. That night, after everyone left, I went upstairs and paid a medical bill he did not know about. It was not small. I logged into my own account, checked the balance scheduled, the payment, and closed the app. The habit calmed me. I always checked balances twice, always scheduled payments ahead, always kept records. It was not defiance. It was survival. I did not tell him because telling him would turn it into a lecture about gratitude, about how I should let him help. I preferred the quiet proof that I could handle my life, even if no one acknowledged it. I also kept copies of things, emails, documents, anything that felt important. Not because I planned to use them, but because I did not trust memory alone. I created a cloud folder with a boring name something no one would ever click. Inside were old emails about my grandfather, trust mentions of beneficiaries' attachments that had been forwarded years ago and forgotten. I saved them the way some people save receipts without knowing why. It was just a habit. At dinner the following week, Victor spoke about the hotels again, about expansion, about protecting the brand. Someone asked what I thought, and before I could answer, Victor said, "She is learning." He looked at me and smiled. "You are smart for a kid." I felt the familiar heat rise in my chest, but I kept my voice steady and said, "Nothing." He took that as agreement. The control worked because it was wrapped in normalcy. It did not look like cruelty, it looked like care. He paid for things. He handled logistics. He spoke with authority. Anyone watching would think I was lucky. They did not see how small he needed me to be. They did not see how every decision came with strings, how every convenience carried a reminder that he could take it back. And I let it happen because fighting would only make me the problem. That was the quiet conditioning. Learn when to speak. Learn when silence costs less. Learn who benefits when you stay calm and who panics when you do not react. Halfway through one dinner, when the conversation turned to inheritance, Victor joked loudly, "We should not leave anything to children until they grow up." He glanced at me and said, "You have time. You are smart for a kid, but life will teach you." I excused myself and went to the kitchen. My hands shook just a little. I rested them on the counter until they stopped. This was how it always went, a small cut here, a soft dismissal. There, nothing dramatic. Nothing you could point to without sounding ungrateful. I did not fight him. Back then, I learned his patterns. Tell me, have you ever been treated like a child by someone who needed you to stay small? Everyone spoke about the hotel empire as if it belonged to my father by default, like gravity had assigned it to him years ago, and no one had thought to question it. The number, alone $62 million, had a way of silencing people before details ever mattered. When relatives mentioned it, they did not say the hotels. They said your father. Hotels. When neighbors asked about my work, they said, "Oh, you help your dad." It never occurred to them that the empire had a structure or a history beyond Victor standing at the center of it all. The truth was far less dramatic and far more precise. The portfolio consisted of 3 primary assets, 2 beachfront hotels along the San Diego coast, each sitting on land purchased decades earlier, and 1 business hotel downtown tied to conference traffic and weekday occupancy. Beyond the buildings themselves, there were franchise agreements, brand compliance requirements, vendor contracts, and the real estate entities that actually held title. None of it was simple, but none of it was magic either. It was paper layered on paper, governed by rules that had been written long before my father started calling it his. My grandfather had built the foundation patiently, and when he grew ill, he did what careful men do. He placed everything into a trust. He did not hand it to Victor. He did not sign it away on a handshake. He created a structure that separated ownership from management, control from authority. The trust named Beneficiaries outlined duties and established guardrails. Victor liked to tell people my grandfather trusted him most. He said it often, usually with a sigh as if burdened by responsibility. One afternoon, while walking through the lobby of the downtown hotel, he said it to me directly. "Your grandfather trusted me, not you." The words landed with weight because they were designed to end the conversation. He did not say, "The trust trusted me." He said the man trusted him. It was personal. It was final. And for a long time, I believed him. Or at least, I acted like I did, because believing him was easier than confronting the alternative that I had never been given the full picture. As the years passed, Victor began to tighten his grip under the language of protection. He brought in consultants he had known for years and introduced them as industry veterans. He placed people loyal to him into operational roles and framed it as stabilizing the brand. He told the board, and anyone who would listen, that he was shielding the hotels from inexperienced decisions. When I asked why certain managers were replaced, he said, "I am protecting the brand," and that phrase ended all debate. I was gradually moved out of meetings I had once attended quietly. My access to reports became delayed, then filtered, then summarized for me, instead of shared. The explanation was always the same: you do not need to worry about this yet. One afternoon during a walkthrough, a general manager mentioned occupancy rates from the previous quarter and got the number wrong. I asked one. Questioned just one about whether they were factoring in weekday corporate bookings tied to a specific convention cycle. He stopped, mid-sentence, blinked, and asked how I knew about that. I shrugged and said I read the reports. Then I let it go. I did not explain that I knew the system by name, that I could trace occupancy trends month by month, that I understood how franchise compliance affected margins. It was not my role to correct him publicly. Victor watched the exchange and later pulled me aside. "You do not need to confuse people," he said. "Let them do their jobs." The implication was clear. My knowledge was inconvenient. In his mind, understanding was a form of interference. He continued reshaping operations around me, assigning his people authority and calling it stewardship. I watched quietly and noticed patterns. Contracts routed through familiar names, vendors selected without competitive bids, expense categories that blurred lines between personal and professional spending. None of it exploded. Overnight, it accumulated like dust. At home, Victor spoke with confidence about expansion and legacy. At meetings, he spoke over me with practiced ease, and always he returned to the same refrain. "Your grandfather trusted me." It was meant to erase questions, and for a while it worked. Then one evening, after yet another meeting where my role had been reduced to note taking, I went home and logged into the state business records portal. It was not dramatic. It was a public website anyone could access. I searched the LLC that held title to one of the beachfront properties and downloaded the operating agreement. I told myself I was just curious. I wanted to read what my life was built on. The document opened slowly, page after page of language that did not mention trust or loyalty or who believed in whom. It mentioned roles, authority conditions, and limits. It mentioned succession triggers and removal clauses. It mentioned ownership in precise, unemotional terms. I printed it and placed it in a folder. The act felt strangely grounding, like putting weight back where it belonged. I did not confront Victor. I did not change my behavior. I simply started reading more. Every time he pushed me out of a conversation, another document found its way into my possession. An amendment here, a board minute there. Always through legitimate channels, always quietly. The more he insisted I did not belong, the more evidence suggested otherwise. The empire everyone assumed was his began to look less like a throne and more like a system, and systems leave trails. The more he pushed me out, the more documents started landing in my hands. By the time my father finished pushing me out of titles, I was already doing the work quietly without anyone noticing. The hotels did not run because Victor gave speeches or shook hands. They ran because hundreds of small decisions were made every day, decisions that never showed up in photos or press releases. I found those decisions and fixed them one by one without asking permission. I started with housekeeping schedules because inefficiency always hides there. Turnover days were misaligned with occupancy peaks, and rooms sat empty longer than they needed to. I adjusted the rotation, slightly moved checklists into a shared system, and reduced overtime hours without cutting staff. No announcement was made. No meeting was called. The numbers improved the following month. Vendor contracts came next. I noticed duplicate services billed under different names and renegotiated rates quietly. By asking simple questions about volume and term length, energy usage followed. The beachfront properties were bleeding money overnight because thermostats were left unmanaged. I coordinated with maintenance to install basic controls, and usage dropped. It was not innovation, it was attention. Then there was the point of sale leakage, small inconsistencies in reporting that added up over time. I flagged them, fixed the settings, and moved on. Each fix was ordinary. Each result compounded. Someone else always took credit. Victor loved that part. At board meetings, he spoke about operational discipline and cost control as if he had discovered it himself. He would gesture broadly and say, "We tightened things up across the portfolio," and the board would nod. He never mentioned my name. When someone did, he smiled and said, "She helps out." That is all. He once pulled me aside after a meeting and said, "You are useful when you stay quiet." He said it like advice, like a compliment wrapped in instruction. I nodded and said nothing. I had learned that my silence made him comfortable. My work made him look good. And that combination was all he wanted. The escalation came when he began using my results as proof that he should have more authority. He told the board the improvements showed the need for centralized control. He referred to me as his assistant more than once, even though I was never hired into that role. It was a subtle erasure, and it worked. People stopped asking me questions directly. They went through him. I let it happen because I did not need their approval. I needed time. One afternoon, while reviewing a compliance checklist, a call came through on my phone. The name belonged to someone high up in hospitality franchise compliance, someone whose emails were usually filtered through executives. I did not answer. I sent a short message saying, "I will call you back later." Victor was standing nearby. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "Who was that?" he asked. "Just someone from compliance," I said casually. He waved it off, uninterested in details. I returned the call later in private and answered questions about brand, standards, and reporting thresholds with precision. When we hung up, the person said, "We have always known you were the one who understood this." I thanked him and moved on. There was no satisfaction in it, just confirmation. Meanwhile, I began keeping records. Not emotional records, not memories, but documents I downloaded board, minutes after meetings, and saved them. I printed vendor contracts that Victor signed and kept copies. When clauses felt off, especially those that routed business toward familiar names, I noticed patterns that suggested self-dealing. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal on its face, but enough to raise questions. If someone ever looked closely, I placed the papers in a folder at home, labeled with a generic name. I did not tell anyone about it. At work, I continued optimizing quietly. I answered questions when asked and declined credit when offered. Victor liked that. He believed he had me exactly where he wanted. Useful, invisible, under control. But something shifted when he began boasting. More aggressively, he spoke about the hotels as if they were extensions of his ego, and he did it using numbers I had improved. He used my work to justify decisions that consolidated his influence and sidelined others, including me. That was when I realized silence alone was not enough. Silence bought time, not safety. I did not confront him. I did not warn him. I simply became more careful. Every document was saved. Every change was logged. Every conversation that touched authority was noted. The work continued. The hotels ran better. The numbers spoke for themselves. And I waited. I was not collecting memories. I was collecting leverage. If you are watching from the U.S., comment your state. These family fights look different everywhere, but the paperwork always tells the same truth. The shift from control to threat did not happen loudly. It happened through access and silence. One morning, I arrived at the office and could not log into the hotel systems. My credentials returned an error, and the shared folders I used every day were suddenly unavailable. I assumed it was a technical issue until Victor walked past my desk and said calmly, "We changed some passwords for security. You do not need access right now." A few hours later, my email stopped syncing. The domain account tied to the hotels was locked and messages bounced back without explanation. When I asked who made the change, he did not answer directly. He said, "This is what happens when too many people touch the same systems," and then he added, "You should not worry about it." That was how he escalated by removing oxygen and calling it protection. The next step came disguised as paperwork. He left a folder on my chair without a note. Inside was a single-page request asking me to sign temporary management consent. The language was soft, almost polite, but the implication was clear. It would formalize my removal and give him uninterrupted authority. I read it once, then again, and felt a familiar tightening in my chest. When I asked why it was needed, Victor said, "We need clarity," and then he said, "You are making things harder than they need to be." He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten me directly. He simply assumed compliance, as if signing was inevitable, as if refusal would mark me as unreasonable. Around that time, Tessa began speaking more freely. She called relatives and framed concern as sympathy. She told them Quinn is unstable. She cannot handle pressure. She means well, but this is a lot for someone her age. The words traveled faster than I did, and I heard them secondhand, always wrapped in worry, always softened with a smile. At a family lunch, she said it within earshot, "I am just worried about her stress levels." Victor nodded in agreement and said softly, "She has always taken things personally." The escalation was no longer about management, it was about credibility. Once you are labeled unstable, your objections become noise. Victor stopped inviting me to meetings entirely. Calendars went out without my name attached. Conversations about budgets and capital happened in the same room while I sat quietly as if invisible. When I asked about an upcoming board session, he said, "It is better if you focus on support tasks." He spoke about money in front of me like I was not there. Numbers decisions, futures all discussed as if my presence was incidental. I did not argue. I did not plead. I took notes not on paper, but in my phone dates, times, exact phrases, who said what I recorded, patterns, not emotions. When Victor handed me the consent form again and asked, "Did you sign yet?" I wrote down the time. When Tessa told someone I was overwhelmed, I noted who was listening. This was not drama. It was documentation. I could feel anxiety creeping in. Not fear, but urgency. The kind that tells you something is being rushed. I did not confront him because confrontation was what he wanted. A reaction would justify his narrative. Instead, I made a call to the bank. Not a complaint, not a demand, just a question. I asked Owen, the relationship manager, if he could help me understand how signature authority worked for the LLC that held one of the properties. I said it like I was just trying to learn. I asked if updates required board approval or trustee confirmation. Owen answered carefully and asked why I was asking. I said I was reviewing documents. He said he could walk me through the process any time. That was enough. I thanked him and hung up. I did not tell Victor about the call. I continued showing up to work with limited access and fewer invitations. I did my assigned tasks and left on time. I watched as Victor grew more impatient. He wanted signatures, not silence. He wanted me to fold quickly before anyone noticed the changes. When he placed the consent form in front of me a third time and said, "We need this done today," I realized the truth. He was not consolidating power. He was racing a clock. The first time he tried to make me sign, I realized he was racing a clock. I did not tell anyone when I decided to speak with a lawyer because I was not ready for a fight and I was not looking for permission. I asked Mara to meet me quietly at her office downtown, and Glenn joined by phone as trustee because this was not about drama. It was about clarity. We sat at a small conference table with the blinds half drawn and the city noise muted behind glass. Mara did not ask how I felt. She asked what documents I had, and I slid a thin folder across the table, emails, operating agreements board minutes, and the unsigned consent form Victor kept pushing toward me. Glenn listened without interruption. When Mara spoke, her voice was calm and measured, and she explained 3 things in plain language the way people explain weather patterns. First, beneficiary rights. She said, if you are the named beneficiary, the assets are held for you, not for convenience, not for management preference. Second, trustee authority. She continued, the trustee executes the trust terms. They do not answer to a manager who wants more control. Third, removal clause. She said, tapping a paragraph on the page. If someone interferes or attempts coercion, there are consequences including removal from any interim role. It was not complicated. It was precise. As she spoke, something settled in me that I had not allowed myself to feel before a certainty. Victor could not take what was not his. He either misunderstood the trust or hoped I would never read it. When I said that out loud, Mara nodded. He cannot take what is not his, she repeated, and the sentence felt like a line, drawn in ink. Not emotion. We discussed next steps, not retaliation, not exposure, just process. Glenn advised, documentation, timelines, copies, original formats. Mara suggested we prepare in case the trust terms needed to be read aloud. There was no rush in their voices. That steadiness mattered. I paid the legal retainer on the spot without hesitation. The number did not make me flinch, because I had planned for contingencies long before this moment, and paying for protection felt practical, not indulgent. I left the office with a checklist, not a script, dates, documents, emails, evidence of coercion. Everything Victor had done to pressure me into signing needed to be preserved, not dramatized. Evidence is not drama. It is protection. 2 days later, Victor sent the email that made his intent explicit. He wrote, I will drag you through court costs if you continue to block necessary decisions. The phrase was meant to scare me, and for a moment it worked. Court is a word that carries weight, especially when used as a threat. But when I read it again, I noticed what he did not say. He did not cite a clause. He did not reference authority. He relied on fear, not fact. I forwarded the email to Mara and added it to the timeline. The preparation continued quietly. I organized the documents by date and relevance, the unsigned consent form, the system access changes, the emails requesting signatures, the bank inquiry notes. Everything fit together like a record, not an argument. We're not planning a fight. We were planning a reading. The trust had rules, and if Victor insisted on pushing past them, the trust itself would respond. I did not confront him after that email. I did not warn him that I had counsel. I continued to decline, signing politely, and kept my responses brief. He grew more agitated, sending follow-ups and asking for meetings. I noted each one. When he referenced legal costs again, I saved the message and closed my laptop. There was a calm that came with preparation. Not confidence exactly, but readiness. The kind that does not need to announce itself. If you have ever been threatened with court just to keep you quiet, hit. Like because that fear is exactly what they count on. The night before the will reading, Victor insisted on a dinner and framed it as a courtesy, a chance to keep things civil before formalities took over. He chose a private room at a coastal restaurant, one of those places where the lighting is soft enough to hide tension and the tables are spaced just far enough apart for strangers to overhear pieces of your life without context. When we arrived, Victor directed everyone to their seats with small gestures like a host, arranging furniture, and when he pointed to mine, it was clear I was not meant to be part of the circle. My chair sat slightly outside the main table, just far enough back that conversation would flow around me, not through me. It was deliberate. He sat at the center, flanked by people he trusted, and spoke as if I were an observer, not a participant. Throughout the meal, he talked about the trust, the hotels, and the future using language that assumed agreement. When the waiter poured wine, Victor waved him away from me. "She is fine," he said, without looking. At one point, a business associate asked a question about operations, and Victor answered smoothly, then added, "She is here to learn, not to decide." He said it casually in front of people who had never met me before, and the words settled into the room like a verdict. I felt the familiar urge to correct him, to say something factual and calm, but I did not. My silence let the moment stand on its own. The humiliation was quiet but complete. As plates were cleared, Victor leaned back and spoke about gratitude. He said families survive when people know their place. He looked directly at me when he said, "Ungratefulness can destroy everything." He framed control as care and dismissal as wisdom, and the people around him nodded because no one wants to challenge a man who sounds certain. Halfway through the dinner, I noticed a manila envelope placed beside Victor's chair. It was thick and labeled neatly. I did not need to open it to know what it was. The disclaimer. The same document he had been pushing. For weeks now, staged like a trap ready to be sprung, I kept my expression neutral and focused on breathing. The shock was not that he had brought it. The shock was that he expected to present it here in front of witnesses, as if pressure would do what reason had not. He spoke about tomorrow with confidence. The reading, he said, will clear things up. He smiled as if clarity were something he owned. The conversation drifted and then circled back to me. Victor asked pointedly, "Are you ready to do what is right?" I met his eyes and said nothing. He sighed theatrically and said, "We will talk later." That was his version of mercy. After dinner, while people stood and gathered coats, Victor placed the envelope closer to me and said quietly, "Do not make this harder than it needs to be." I nodded and stepped away. In the parking lot, I paused long enough to send one message: "We are proceeding tomorrow." I sent it to a number I had saved weeks earlier and then put my phone away. I did not explain. I did not add context. The message was enough. Back at home, Mara sent a brief update. The packet was ready: trust excerpts, authority letter, bank instruction draft, board resolution template. Each document prepared not to provoke, but to respond. There was comfort in knowing that paper would speak when voices failed. I slept little that night, not from fear, but from anticipation. The humiliation had reached its peak. Victor believed the room belonged to him. He did not realize the documents did. The room was quiet when we sat down the next morning. Not the polite quiet of waiting, but the tight silence that comes when people expect something unpleasant to happen. Victor took his seat first and placed the manila envelope on the table in front of him, like a final argument. Around us, relatives and board members adjusted papers and avoided eye contact. Mara sat to my left, Glenn across from her, Rhea near the end of the table. The lights were too bright, the air too cold. Victor cleared his throat and said, "Before we begin, I want this resolved." He slid the envelope toward me and said, "Sign it now. We do not need delays." He looked around the table as if gathering support. "Do it here so we can move on." I picked up the pen he handed me, felt its weight, and then placed it gently on the table. Without opening the envelope, I said nothing. The moment stretched. Someone shifted in their chair. Victor frowned and said, "Are you going to make this difficult?" I did not answer. Mara leaned forward slightly and said, "Sir, you should know better." Victor laughed once short and sharp. "Oh, please," he said. "Just read whatever you have to read." Mara did not respond to the tone. She opened the packet in front of her and began reading. The trust names Quinn as the sole beneficiary. She said, her voice steady, clear, "The trustee holds authority to execute decisions in alignment with the trust terms." Victor straightened. The interim manager holds no voting rights and no authority to compel signatures from the beneficiary. Mara continued. The words landed one after another, and with each sentence, Victor's confidence drained from his face. He opened his mouth to interrupt, and Mara held up one hand. Glenn slid a document across the table. Authority letter, he said calmly. In the event of interference or attempted coercion, the trust triggers removal. Victor stood up halfway through the sentence and said, "This is ridiculous. You are misinterpreting everything." Rhea spoke for the first time. Compliance requires confirmation that no unauthorized pressure was applied, she said. The system access changes and signature requests constitute a violation. This is a legal proceeding, Glenn said gently. Sit down. Victor sat down hard, his face flushed. He said, "You cannot do this. I built this." He looked around the room, searching for allies, and found none. Mara continued reading. The beneficiary is not required to sign any management consent under these conditions. Any attempt to force such consent invalidates interim authority. The room felt smaller. Victor's voice rose. "This is manipulation," he said. "She is manipulating you all," Rhea replied calmly. "The record shows otherwise." Victor stood again and slammed his hand on the table, and Glenn said, "This is a legal proceeding. Please lower your voice." That was the first break. The moment when Victor realized anger would not save him. Mara closed the folder and said, "Given the violations, we are initiating immediate changes. Victor is required to surrender access keys and system credentials today. He is to sign a resignation as interim operator or risk a freeze on signature authority." Victor stared at me, then at the documents, then back at me. He said, "You would do this to your own father." I met his eyes for the first time that morning and said nothing. The silence answered him better than words. If you have ever waited your whole life for one sentence to set you free, this is it. Victor reached for the envelope again, then stopped. His hand shook slightly. Glenn placed a resignation form in front of him and said, "Please sign here." Victor hesitated, then scrawled his name. The room exhaled, and that was when my father realized losing control feels like losing air. The next morning did not feel dramatic. It felt administrative, which somehow made it heavier. I sat in a small glass office at the bank while Owen reviewed the updated signature card. He spoke in a calm, neutral tone, as if we were adjusting a mailing address, not removing my father from every operating account associated with the hotels. He confirmed the change, twice asked me to. Initial, then slid the paper into a folder. When he looked up, he said softly, "Access has been removed. Victor will not be able to authorize payments or view balances." I nodded and thanked him and walked out into the bright San Diego sun with the strange realization that power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply clicks into place like a lock turning. The board met that afternoon not in a grand room but around a long table with water pitchers and printed agendas. Glenn opened the meeting and stated the purpose, a transition of operator authority, effective immediately. There was no applause, no raised voices, just procedure. I spoke only when asked, answered questions directly, and deferred to policy when opinions tried to surface. The vote passed unanimously, and the minutes reflected a clean transfer. I did not give a speech. I did not thank anyone. I followed the process, and the process carried me. Family reacted faster than the board. By evening, my phone filled with messages, some cautious, some accusatory. A few relatives asked if everything was true. Others accused me of tearing the family apart. Victor did not wait long to respond. His version spread quickly. Quinn manipulated the lawyer. He told anyone who would listen that I had planned this for years, that I had turned professionals against him, that I was unstable and power-hungry. The story shifted depending on the audience, but the message stayed the same. He was the victim. I was the problem. By the second day, he escalated further. He sent an email copying half the board, threatening legal action. "I will destroy your reputation in the industry," he wrote. "I have contacts everywhere. I have built this brand, and I can tear it down." The words were familiar. The same control dressed in a new suit. I did not reply. I forwarded the message to Mara and Glenn and returned to work. Real consequences began to appear, quietly. Vendors called to confirm who was authorized to approve invoices. The accounting team asked for updated workflows. I signed documents, reviewed reports, and kept my tone even. When Victor tried to call a meeting, no one accepted the invite. When he showed up unannounced, security asked him to leave. That afternoon, a call came in from an unfamiliar number I answered, and a man introduced himself as an owner I had worked with years earlier. "We have known you were the one keeping it afloat," he said. "Congratulations." I thanked him briefly and ended the call. I did not share the news. I did not correct the family narrative. I let the work speak. The audit began the following week, not with sirens but spreadsheets. Rhea led a review of vendor contracts and conflict disclosures. The findings were ordinary and devastating. Favoritism and supplier selection expenses, misclassified to avoid oversight agreements, signed without proper review. Each item alone was small together. They told a story Victor could no longer control. I watched the process unfold without comment. I did not gloat. I did not rush. The paper trail did what arguments never could. By Friday, Victor tried again, this time privately. He left a voicemail saying we needed to talk before things went too far. I saved it and did not respond. The board reconvened to discuss remediation steps. Legal costs were approved and responsibility assigned. Victor's name appeared only as a subject, not a decision maker. As the meeting ended, Glenn closed his folder and said quietly, he did not just lose the empire, he was about to lose his story. He came to where I lived in the early evening when the light outside was soft and forgiving, the kind of hour people choose when they want mercy. I heard the knock and knew before opening the door who it would be. When I did, Victor stood there, without the posture he used to wear like armor, his shoulders lower, his hands empty. For the first time, he said my name without trimming it down. "Quinn," he said quietly as if testing the sound. I stepped aside enough to let him speak, but not enough to invite him in. He did not comment on my place or my life. He looked past me at the hallway and swallowed. "The bank keeps calling," he said, then rushed the words as if speed could make them smaller. "Just sign something so the bank will stop calling my loan." It was not dramatic. It was specific, a number, a deadline, a clause. I could hear the interest rate in his voice. He tried to smile. "I did it to protect you," he added quickly. The old sentence dressed up for a new audience. I did not answer right away. I waited until the silence grew uncomfortable, then said, "You did it to keep me small." He blinked as if I had changed the language without warning. He shifted tactics immediately, bringing up memories he thought still worked. The summer trips, the dinners where he paid the bill, the times he said he believed in me. He apologized without owning anything. "I am sorry if you felt hurt." He said I never meant it like that. He reached for my arm, then stopped himself. I listened and felt tired, not angry, just aware of how practiced this was. The apology was a tool. The memories bait. He was trying to step back into the circle where he decided who mattered. I did not argue. I did not list the emails or the threats or the signatures. I did not explain the trust or the board. I said one sentence, "Talk to your attorney." He stared at me as if the words were a locked door. He tried again, softer this time. "We are family." He said. I shook my head once. "Not like this. I did not sign anything. I did not promise to call." I closed the door gently and stood there for a moment, listening to his footsteps fade. The consequence arrived quickly without my help. His personal loan triggered a review. The guarantee clause did what guarantee clauses do. The calls did not stop. The pressure moved from me to him, exactly where it belonged. Comment boundaries. If you have ever had to say no to someone who only loved you when they controlled you, and when he could not control me, he tried to break the system. The breakpoint did not arrive in one dramatic collapse. It arrived through findings and follow-ups, through emails that tightened like a net, and meetings that stopped including his name except as a problem to be solved. The internal audit moved steadily, and the results were both ordinary and devastating. Rhea presented the first set of issues in a clean format with dates and dollar amounts. Vendor favoritism, she said, pointing to a sequence of contracts awarded repeatedly to the same supplier without competitive review. The pricing was not outrageous enough to shock, but the pattern was clear, and the conflict disclosures were missing. Expense misclassification. Came next charges coded under maintenance that were actually discretionary spending, and reimbursements pushed through categories designed to avoid additional approval thresholds. Then the worst of it, the self-dealing contracts, agreements signed by Victor that routed services through intermediaries tied to people he knew with terms that benefited them more than the hotels. The board did not gasp. They did not shout. They grew quiet in the way professionals do when they realize a risk has been living inside their organization for years. Glenn summarized the implications, and the room shifted from analysis to action. The board required Victor to explain and to repay any amounts deemed improper or unsupported. A formal demand letter was drafted, not emotional, not insulting, just factual and firm. Victor responded through his attorney, and the bills began to climb because every defensive email, every argument about intent, every delay added another charge to his legal fees. The irony was sharp. The same man who threatened to drag me through court costs was now bleeding money through paperwork of his own making. The bank reacted as banks do when operators change and covenants rely on stability. Owen notified us that the lender was reviewing covenant compliance due to the operator transition. They wanted updated projections, confirmation of governance, and assurance that operational controls were intact. It was not punishment, it was risk management, and Victor had built the risk. When the bank began asking questions, Victor had no authority to answer them and no access to the accounts to reassure anyone. The pressure did not lift, it narrowed around him. One by one, his allies went quiet. A relative who once echoed his complaints stopped returning calls. A board member he thought he could lean on asked to keep communication in writing. Tessa posted vague messages online about loyalty and betrayal, then deleted them when no one engaged. The noise became his only companion. He tried to manufacture support, but people prefer distance when facts look ugly. Victor attempted to show up at a property again and was met with polite refusal. He was told to coordinate through counsel. He left angry and alone. In the middle of this, the board needed a plan to satisfy the bank and stabilize operations. I delivered it on one page, a refinance strategy for the downtown hotel that addressed interest exposure and improved cash flow. The document was straightforward rates, timeline, collateral overview, projected savings. It was not flashy. It was competent. The room read it quietly, and then one board member said, "This is exactly what we needed." I nodded and said, "We can adjust assumptions if the lender requests it." I did not say how long I had been thinking about it or how familiar I was with every line item. I kept my profile low because the work was the point, not the applause. The paper trail thickened as decisions were documented. Board resolutions were approved, meeting minutes recorded demand letters, sent remediation plans, drafted and filed. Each item was placed into folders and emailed to the right people in clean subject lines that anyone could follow. It was the kind of process a middle-aged American woman could picture, because it was the same kind of process used to handle a school dispute, a property repair, an insurance claim, except scaled up, with more zeros. The discipline was the same, and Victor could not compete with it because his power had always relied on noise, not documentation. As weeks passed, Victor's reputation began to erode, not through gossip but through records. His attorney requested extensions. The board denied them politely. The bank asked for updates, and we provided them. Victor asked for meetings and received silence. He was isolated in the most painful way, not by cruelty but by procedure. And that is when I understood the deepest satisfaction of it all. The empire did not punish him. His own paperwork did. The picture came into focus slowly, not with an announcement, but with confirmations that arrived from different directions over time. During a routine call about franchise standards, a senior compliance lead referred to advice I had given months earlier under an abbreviated name, initials only. The room went quiet when he thanked me for guidance that had helped avoid penalties across multiple properties. No one looked at me directly, but the recognition settled in the space. I had been invited more than once to advise on hospitality systems and compliance structures, always quietly, always without attaching my full name, because I preferred work over visibility. It was not a secret identity. It was a deliberate choice to stay useful rather than visible. As governance stabilized, Glenn scheduled a trust review, and for the first time the conversation moved beyond defense into purpose. The scholarship fund my grandfather had established sat alongside the hotels in the trust documents carefully, structured with clear distribution authority resting with me. The amount was not theatrical, but meaningful and designed to last. As I read the language again, I understood what he had intended, not just preservation of assets, but preservation of values. I proposed a workforce scholarship aimed at housekeeping and front desk staff tuition support for certifications, language programs, and management tracks. The idea was practical and familiar to anyone who had watched good employees struggle to move up. The board approved it without hesitation, and implementation began within weeks. When the announcement went out internally, the response was quiet. Gratitude, not applause. Victor watched all of this from the outside. He saw that I had not only retained control, but redirected the legacy itself. The hotels were no longer trophies to be claimed. They were systems with rules, and the trust was no longer leverage. It was a framework. His last justification evaporated when he realized there was no role left for him to dominate. He had not lost to a moment, he had lost to a structure. I finalized the governance changes with the same calm I had used throughout: anti-nepotism provisions, conflict of interest, disclosures, mandatory reviews. These were not punishments, they were protections, and once signed, they made a return impossible. The system would outlive any single personality. I thought of the nights I had been told to stay quiet and understood that silence had been preparation. He thought he was fighting a girl. He was fighting a system built to outlive him. I visited one of the coastal hotels early in the morning, before meetings, before emails, before anyone expected decisions. The lobby was quiet in that particular way that only exists before the day begins. The air carried the smell of fresh coffee and cleaning solution mixed together, a scent I had learned to associate with readiness. A front desk associate looked up and smiled and said "Good morning" without hesitation. A housekeeper passed with a cart and nodded. The building felt steady, like it knew what it was for. I walked slowly, not inspecting, not correcting, just observing, and for the first time in a long while I felt no urgency to prove anything. I thought about how often I had been told to speak up louder, to fight back, harder to make noise to be seen. The truth did not need that. The truth had waited patiently in folders and minutes and clauses until the moment it was invited to speak. When it did not shout. It simply stood. There were days after the board decisions when the quiet felt heavy, when I expected another message, another demand, another attempt to pull me back into the old patterns, but the noise faded. Victor sent one message late one night asking if we could meet just to talk. I read it once and did not reply. I did not block him. I did not explain. I placed the phone face down and went back to what I was doing. Boundaries did not require speeches. They required consistency. Over time, the work settled into a rhythm. Operations ran smoother. Not because I was controlling them, but because the systems were allowed to do their jobs. People stopped asking who was in charge and started asking what came next. That was the change I had wanted all along. Not dominance, but stability. The legacy my grandfather left was never about the size of the assets. It was about stewardship, about protecting something long enough for others to benefit from it. I understood that now, in a way I could not have when I was younger. Family is not ownership. It is not leverage. It is not a room where money is discussed without you. It is responsibility. And when that responsibility is abused, it must be removed. The hotels stood not as monuments to power, but as places where people worked and rested and moved through their lives. That was enough. The peace that followed was not loud. It did not feel like victory banners or apologies or reunions. It felt like walking through a lobby at dawn knowing nothing was about to be taken from you. If you have lived through family control or inheritance pressure, share your story in the comments. You are not alone. And if you are wondering what happened to Victor after he lost control, that is a story for another day.